So I've been asked, how did I come to approach the breath in this way or in the way that I do? So there's many ways to approach the breath. Oftentimes it's approached with an element of controlling it. There's different reasons for that. When I think of breath control techniques such as yogic breathing, pranayama, there's a way that the breath can be controlled in order to achieve a certain state of consciousness, if you will. And so it's very specific. There's a way to breathe in a specific way that elicits or evokes a certain feeling, a certain state, and it can be very beneficial. When I think of yogic breathing, or oftentimes in a more trauma-informed lens, there's this effort to regulate the nervous system, which usually entails, at the very least, a controlled exhale, to kind of slow the exhale down. Is that a way to calm and soothe? For whatever reason, I've come to approach the breath thinking about the biomechanics of what's happening there in the body. And so everything points to the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the muscle that is in charge of breathing. It's the muscle that somehow breathes us. So it's also the muscle that we use to breathe in the specific ways that we do, especially on the inhale. And I say especially on the inhale simply because when we're inhaling, that muscle, the diaphragm, is contracting. And when it does, it lowers, it pushes down into the lower cavity, the lower part of the torso, the abdomen. And so when it does, well, something has to move. And luckily our abdomen is soft and pliable, and so it will give way if we allow it to. And that's happening so that air can be drawn in, making space for the lungs. Now, on the exhale, that very same muscle, the diaphragm, decontracts. It releases, it relaxes. And so from its pushed down position, it goes back up and continues to be that dividing point from what's below it and what's above it, these two aspects of our torso. Now, the beautiful part about the breath, encoded in the very etymology of it, because in so many languages, breath and spirit are one and the same. And I think that is manifested in an embodied way by just realizing how it's a part of our autonomic nervous system. We're always breathing, even when we're not aware of it or thinking about it. And so in these instances, which is most of our life, I like to call the diaphragm the muscle of divine will. What is willing this muscle to contract and decontract? But life itself, something divine, if you will. Now, when I'm placing my attention on it, my consciousness, my awareness on the activity of breathing, as with anything or event that is being witnessed or watched, it will change. And so as I bring my attention to my breath, it changes. And then I have a choice. I have a choice as to what do I do with this breath. And so as breath work is a form of superoxygenation, we're inviting more oxygen cells into our bloodstream. That's usually happening because we're filling our lungs more to their potential than they get filled when we're breathing without the conscious attention on it. So in other words, when the muscle of the divine will is breathing us, it's sufficient. It's doing the job. It's keeping us alive. But by no means are my lungs getting filled to their capacity. Now, when I apply my attention and choose to fill my lungs to capacity, whether it be very quickly or very slowly, I'm exercising my choice, my will. And so in these instances, I like to call the diaphragm the muscle of personal will. And this personal will is being applied on top of divine will. For when I take my attention away from my breathing, I don't stop breathing. The breathing continues, and it always will, until that final breath. Now, since really the diaphragm is the principal muscle in charge of bringing the air into the body, and to do so, it has to contract. As I said before, to exhale, all that is required is for that same muscle to decontract. It releases the tension created by contraction. And when it does that, it can happen quickly. Now, somebody wise once told me that the true test of strength of a muscle is not by how much it can contract or the force it can exert through contraction, but rather how quickly it can decontract. And so as the diaphragm strengthens over time and with practice, the decontraction or the exhale can happen fairly quickly. What can happen with the rest of our body and muscles is that somehow they want to get involved. Maybe somewhere in our throats, we've learned to use that ujjayi breath and constrict the opening. And that's okay for achieving a soothing environment or relaxing. Or maybe we've contracted in our belly somewhere, or somewhere in our chest. And all that contraction requires energy. It takes energy to contract a muscle. And so I look at the exhale as an opportunity to do nothing. An opportunity for the non-doing to be a part of the cycle that keeps us alive. And so on the out-breath, I like to call the diaphragm the muscle of surrender. Because nothing is required for the air to leave our body. Now, of course, it doesn't require my conscious attention for air to come into my body, because I will breathe anyway. And yet to truly fill my lungs, and I think to myself, if I'm consciously breathing, why not? Why not fill these lungs with oxygen? Yeah, this is the stuff of life. And I can take my time doing it. I can savor that process. And that's where that egoic part of me contributes to that, to the cycle. It must, in order to bring fulfillment to those lungs. My personal will, my persona, my egoic self contributes, co-creates. And yet, when the co-creation is complete, I let go, or I let's go. And so when I approach conscious connected breathwork, there's two things that I believe to be happening. If we continue for a long period of time connecting our inhales and exhales and exhales and inhales, and take the time to fill the lungs with air with each in-breath, over a period of time, we will feel that super oxygenation in our body. We will feel the energy input in our system. And that is an experience, maybe even a peak event. And as we do that, as that energy circulates through our system in a more accelerated rate, it brings forth with it any stuck or dormant properties or elements that are in our cells, in our nervous system, in our being, the samskaras that get purified, that get carried away with this added circulation of oxygen. And so in a breathwork experience, this is what's happening. As we take the time, a good solid hour, to do exactly that. And it's non-specific. We're not targeting any particular event or phenomenon. But we stay open to whatever arises. Now, the other thing that I believe to be happening when we engage in a conscious, connected breathwork practice is that we're refining or maybe honing the way or the frequency at which we bring our conscious attention to this part of life, to this breathing cycle. And the more we do that, the more that we apply our agency, our personal will. And so in this practice, I'm not pretending that this is the right way to breathe. But I know that I'm creating an imprint, a new pattern, perhaps even a new habit of applying this choice to my breathing when I'm aware of it. And I become aware of my breath more often and more frequently on a day-to-day basis. I can't be aware of my breathing 24 hours a day. I'd be totally distracted. We'd get nothing done as humans. But it is a way to come into being rather than doing. And it's a way to heal and bring medicine into oftentimes this starved pattern that is developed over time where we're not really bringing in a lot of oxygen via divine will. And so by developing a regular practice of conscious connected breathwork, what I've seen in my life over time is that I'm more aware of my breath more often. And when I am, we take a big breath in. With whatever I'm experiencing, I breathe into it rather than out at it, which is often the case with a lot of breathing techniques. Using all this force and either squeezing the breath out or forcing the breath out. Rather, I harness that energy on the inhale. And that has now become intuitive in my life. I breathe in to it rather than out at it. And this is how I've come to approach breathwork. That there's an appropriate part of the cycle where there is a doing. I think this is a part of the human potential. That on the inhale, on that part of the cycle, I'm playing a part. That I don't need to control all aspects of life. I have to let go and relinquish control at some point, or for some part. And I let that be on the out breath, where nothing is actually required. That this part of living is a sort of non-doing. And it's a conscious surrender. I'm not dissociating from what's going on. On the contrary, I'm creating the permission for those parts of me that somehow believe or think that they need to contribute to what's happening anyway. And so that's part of the mystery for me. This is where the moniker non-dual breathing comes into play, because when personal will and divine will meet, and there is a non-doing, there's no divine will separate from personal will. There's no personal will separate from divine will. And so it's non-dual. There's something that just is happening without the personal will making it happen. But of course it did make it happen. And yet it wasn't contrived in a way in thinking that it's the only thing making something happen, because somehow that's part of the pitfall of awakening, of the direct path. It's thinking that I am doing all of this. In a breathwork experience where we're consciously connecting our breath over a long period of time, there's that super oxygenation. The energy is circulating, it's accelerating, it's building. And as it does, the doing that has played a role into generating that energy is kind of not necessarily subsiding, but it's melding in with that which is happening anyway, which is we're never not breathing. And so as that merges and melds together, there's something very mysterious that happens. There's this energy buildup, maybe a crescendo that goes towards some sort of, well, maybe a peak or a plateau, that something is just, we become breathed. And the interesting thing is that on our normal day-to-day, when we're not thinking about breathing, we are being breathed. We're always being breathed. Well, I think to how many countless events and retreats and workshops I've been to, and somebody says, take a deep breath or breathe. Well, we're always breathing, always. And so that is happening anyway. And then when we apply consciously ourselves to the process of breathing, that generates a certain energy, and it merges again with that divine will. We come to this peak or plateau where we're being breathed again, but not in some sort of habitual or unconscious way. On the contrary, it's a very conscious act to have brought this energy upon us by consciously breathing. And so there's a breathing, we're being breathed in a way that is different than being breathed in our normal day-to-day life. And that application of the self, of the person, of my personal will, of my agency is, to me, what makes the difference. And that requires work. I have to apply myself. And so, therefore, there's that word work in breath work. It takes your conscious effort, actually, to bring yourself to that point that then requires no more effort. And so there's this mystery, there's this paradox, there's this something that we can't describe, the ineffable. And so the diaphragm, on the in-breath, the muscle of either divine will or personal will. And on the out-breath, the muscle of surrender. No will is necessary. I think of the old adage about the river. There's no need to push the river. The flow is happening anyway. There's no need to hold it back either. It's okay to let it do what it does. Thank you for receiving some of the wisdom that I have extracted from the breath.